Hey guys, welcome to Wink's Workshop. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this epoxy river desk for my office. I'm going to go through the entire process beginning to end, and hopefully you guys find this video helpful. I want to go through this thoroughly enough that you can actually build one of these by the time you watch this video. The link to all of the material and stuff that I use is in the description of this video, so make sure you check that out. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments. And hopefully you find this video useful enough to hit the subscribe button and see any other videos that I come out with, like how to make concrete countertops. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Alright, so here in the beginning, you will see what this thing looked like as the original slab of wood. I purchased it from a local dealer. It is black walnut. I ended up cutting a decent amount of it down. There was just a lot of unusable pieces kind of at the ends that I ended up cutting off, which of course we will get to. But once you kind of get your slab of wood home, the first thing you need to do, if it's in the raw state that mine was, is of course plane it down. And if you're like me, you don't really have a planer, unfortunately. Fortunately, this is actually pretty easy to cut down with a router. I have a DeWalt router, plunge router, and that is what I used. I got a bit for cutting stuff down. I think it's 2-inch bit, worked really well, had no issues whatsoever. You do want to make sure you go kind of slow, you know, passing over the wood. But the really important thing is the router sled. Now you can either buy these or you could do what I do and make one. They're actually super easy to make. I made mine out of 3/4-inch plywood. Basically cut it just wide enough so that my router fits in there perfectly, and then made the hole in it just big enough for that router bit to fit through. And you know, that way of course it doesn't hit on the edge or anything when you plunge it down or anything of the sort. And then you of course want some nice tall sides on it, that way it doesn't flex down when you go across the wood. And then of course you're going to want to set up a pretty flat, stable base and set something up to set your router sled on as you go across. I used some paste wax, Minwax was the brand I believe, to put on here just to make the router slide really well. And that was basically just of building the router sled. Pretty simple, straightforward process and really useful. I was surprised at how well it works. I planed this thing down. I did not count the number of times that I went over planing it down, but it was a number of times because it was a little bit wavy. There were some rough spots in it. And then, you know, there were just kind of some spots that, you know, I just wanted to cut down and get past basically. I have of course planed down one side, kind of got it relatively flat, and then flipped it over. Then that way it is laying on that perfectly flat side, and then I planed the opposite side. That way, you know, you're kind of planing on a flat surface, because when it's rough on both sides, it's kind of hard to get a, you know, a flat surface for it to lay on in the beginning. So you're gonna plane that entire thing down both sides, get it all nice and smooth, and it's not really gonna be perfect. You can kind of get it to a pretty rough state, relatively smooth. You don't really need to sand it, 'cause we'll do the sanding part after we do the epoxy. So just get it planed down, and then you are ready to kind of lay it out. And that's when we get to the layout part. And this was kind of confusing. Not really confusing, just kind of difficult to figure out as far as how I wanted to lay out. I didn't want the river like symmetrical perfectly in the middle, so I knew I wanted to cut it at a little bit of an angle so that I get an effect of the river kind of going from one side and then veering over, you know, kind of towards the other side. And I really wasn't sure that I wanted this big kind of lake part on the entire edge and corner of my desk. That originally wasn't in my plan, but after I cut it and kind of started laying it out for the length that I wanted, which was, you know, a little bit over 5 feet is kind of what I was shooting for. And, you know, 5.5 to 6 feet by 26 inches or so was kind of what my goal was. After I kind of started laying it out, I really wasn't sure how to make that work with a couple screw ups that there were in the wood. So then I got the idea to kind of make that little lake on the edge that you see. I set them up and kind of adjusted them around, tried flipping them around a couple different directions, and ultimately kind of found something that I really liked, and that was what I went with. You could make like a box that's about the size of the desk that you want and kind of lay over it, that way you can see kind of exactly what it would look like. I feel like I'm pretty good at envisioning this sort of stuff, so if you kind of have trouble kind of visualizing things, I highly suggest you do that, because it will most certainly help with that process. Next, we're going to move along to just cleaning up the edge. When you have all this raw wood on the edge, all the live edge stuff, you kind of need to get that stuff out of the way because it's brittle, it'll come apart, it just doesn't stick very well, to be perfectly honest. So you want to get as much of that off as possible. I start out with a chisel, and then I hit one of my friends up who has a lot of woodworking tools, and got a draw knife from him and did that the rest of the way. That worked so much better than the chisel. I did still need a good chisel to kind of clean up some of these edges, but that draw knife I was able to cut down and just basically pull all that bark off extremely well. I highly recommend you do this. If you don't have one, buy one. It'll probably be worth the money because it did make things so much easier. And then after I went over with the draw knife and kind of got it cut the way I wanted it. Sorry I don't have any great videos of that process because my camera kept moving. The other thing that I did was took a wire wheel for my drill. I put it on my drill, and then I used that to kind of go over all these edges and make sure all the loose stuff's off, because it's really important to get all the loose stuff off. That way the epoxy has a really good solid edge to adhere to, something that's not going to come apart. You want the most solid part of the wood to adhere to that epoxy. And once you get all of that stuff off, get it down to where you want it, then you're going to want to mix up a little bit of epoxy. I mean, a very tiny amount. You're going to take it, you're going to brush it over all of those edges where that epoxy is going to be touching. And that's just going to basically be a primer coat. This does a couple things. It prevents air from leaking out of the wood into your epoxy, which creates a ton of air bubbles in your epoxy and can create some serious problems. And like I said, it's a primer, just helps it adhere better, so you know you're getting a good solid coat of epoxy all the way along that edge before you do the the big pour of epoxy. Once you get all of that done, you're going to want to make your forms. Now, I used 3/4 inch melamine. I did not spray any mold release on it. I've seen a lot of people do that. I do recommend it. It is a fantastic idea. I did not do it though. And I really didn't have much trouble. I did tear up my forms. You know, the edge forms were basically unusable after it, but after it cures up for about 3 or 4 days, it does pop off pretty easy because that epoxy kind of unadheres to that melamine. So you really shouldn't have too much of an issue there. If you don't have mold release, I wouldn't really worry about it too much. One thing you're going to want to do whenever you cut these edges, you're going to want to make sure they are extra tall. That way you have some, extra room on top of the wood, unlike on, say, for example, a concrete countertop where you might make the edge the exact thickness of the thing that you're working on. You want a little extra space in case you have to pour a little more epoxy in there or something along those lines. Once you get all those, get those cut down. I basically just cut my bottom piece the exact size of the desk that I want to be, or maybe an inch bigger both directions. That way you can come back and you can cut the edges off, make the edges perfectly square and all that sort of stuff. So make it a little bit bigger, roughly the size that you want your final product to be. And then you're going to put your edge forms all the way around it and fasten it on. I fastened mine on with a nail gun and just used some silicone. So I took silicone and I put silicone on all the edges of the form before I put it on, then put it on and nailed it. That did a really good job. I did not have any epoxy leak out. I've seen a lot of people in videos put their forms together and then put the silicone in. That's not a good idea. I would say make sure you put it on all the way. That way you have that entire 3/4 inch thickness full of silicone. Makes it far less likely that any epoxy is going to drip out onto the floor and screw up your project. So once you get all the forms on and assembled, then we get to the exciting part. This is where we get to mix up our epoxy. Now you're going to want to make sure you set up on a level surface.
Clamp your wood down, that way it doesn't float. The one mistake that I made on this particular one is I just set it up on sawhorses, which is perfectly fine. However, whenever I clamped it down, I did clamp it a little too much, and it caused the form to bow a little bit, so I had to do a little bit more planing afterwards than I should have had to do, and desk ended up being a little bit thinner than I wanted it to be, which honestly wasn't that big of a deal, but it was a total pain to work through. So make sure it's flat, lay it on a flat, nice flat solid surface, clamp your wood down, make sure it's nice and straight, all that sort of stuff. Put a straight edge across it, that way you know you are good to go. Now once you do that, we are ready to mix up some epoxy. Now, the stuff that I used was a black diamond, and I cannot remember the other brand of colorant that I used, but like I said, all the products that I used are in the description. I did use liquid glass epoxy. I ordered 2 of the 3-gallon kits. I used, I believe, about 4 to 4.5 gallons on this project. I shouldn't have had to use that much. It should have been right at 3 gallons. You can kind of measure the middle. It's pretty easy to measure for the most part. Just kind of figure out your average width, multiply it by your total distance and height, and that's pretty much the gist of it. You'll of course want to convert that volume into gallons. I believe you take that volume divided by 236 or 232. I can put the formula in the description. That'll give you your total volume of epoxy in gallon. Once you get that done, you are ready to mix up your epoxy once you know how much you need. Put your colorant in. I put a lot of colorant in mine because I did want a lot of blue. I really love blue. It's my favorite color. So of course I went a little overboard, which I don't think there was anything wrong with that. It turned out absolutely fantastic. I couldn't be happier. The mica powder is super cheap. Don't want to oversaturate it, but put a couple spoonfuls in there if you want to. Make sure you mix it up really, really well. It's going to take a couple minutes to mix it up. I think the instructions say 4 to 5 minutes, just to make sure that it is all mixed up, because you don't want any spots in there where that epoxy isn't mixed with the hardener or anything like that, because that can cause problems. Once I got it all mixed up, I let it set there for a second. I took my heat gun, which is pretty useful for this project, heat gun or a torch. Let your epoxy sit there, let the bubbles come to the top, and once the bubbles come to the top, just hit it with that heat gun, and it'll get rid of all the bubbles out of the epoxy before you pour. And if you pour nice and easy, you will pretty much end up with a bubbleless pour. Pouring was the really fun part. It was super exciting getting to see it go in and see what it was actually going to look like. As you can tell, I had to mix up a little bit more and then pour a little bit more in. And then I had these couple spots, like a couple lines and a couple small holes that I had to fill. And, those spots on this desk look absolutely spectacular. I love having just kind of a few random spots out in the wood. So if you find like some weak wood that you can, kind of dig into and get some stuff out so you can have some spots like that, I do recommend it because it looks freaking awesome. I put this in my shop that has small shop that has an air conditioner, and put a fan on it. I think I put the fan on it after about 12 to 18 hours probably. I kept the room at about 72. Kind of babysat it for a little bit, with the heat gun coming back, popping the bubbles, because you definitely do not want those. There were a couple times I had to come back, 24, 48 hours after and fill a few spots, just because there's this little mushroom looking spot on my desk, and there was a lot of air in there that just kind of kept coming out. So I put a little bit more epoxy in that a couple times, and then just kind of waited until that was fully cured before I sanded it. Whenever I popped the forms off, I basically just took a hammer and just smashed them off. Took a wooden wedge, drove underneath the wood and the form, and basically once you got a little bit in there, it kind of popped right off. Once you get it off, you are ready to do some planing, assuming your epoxy is dry. I think 3 to 4 days is the cure time. 72 hours, actually, if I recall correctly. Go back to your planer or router, either one, get it nice and flat. Then you're gonna want to take your sander and, fine sand it. Just make sure it is nice and smooth. For the final coat on this thing, I use the Rubio Monocoat. I've heard good things about it. I like the way it looks. make sure you get all the dust and everything off before you put that final coat on there. The monocoat seems to be great. I think it takes about has a 7-day cure time. I think at the time I'm recording this, I've had this in my office for about a month now. Ordered the legs off Amazon. I absolutely could not be happier with the way this entire project turned out. It was a lot of fun. It turned out awesome, and the best thing is I built it. If you saw in the video in the beginning, you will see that it glows, and I ran some LEDs underneath it. I just took some clips and they have like 3M tape on them, stuck them to the underside of my legs, and then ran the LED strip through them, and they kind of just hang below the epoxy and glow, and it causes the epoxy to glow, which looks really cool. So you can do like a colored epoxy and then still do some LEDs underneath or something along those lines if you want to, and get a pretty cool glowing effect. So yeah, that is pretty much the gist of this project. If you guys have any questions, make sure you put them in the description. I would appreciate if you would hit the subscribe button. I will be having many other videos coming. Various DIY things, bathroom remodel, concrete countertops. That will be my next video that will be dropping on how I make some custom concrete countertops that look really awesome, and they're super easy to do actually. So make sure you hit the subscribe button, and I will be catching you guys later. Thanks for watching.